Hey everyone, welcome to Life Reflections. Today I'm sharing a life story that might just hit home for you. If you enjoy it, give it a thumbs up, drop a comment with your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button to join me for more moments that matter. Let's dive in.
Melanie Richards had always known what it meant to hustle. Born into a family that never had much, she grew up on the kind of street where the sound of sirens became a backdrop to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. Her mother, a waitress at a small diner, worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Her father, absent most of her childhood, left a void that Melanie tried to fill with her art. But art, as she'd been told time and time again, was not going to pay the bills. At the age of 16, Melanie had already learned to bury her dreams deep within herself, keeping her sketchbooks hidden behind the walls of her small room. Her passion for drawing, capturing the world with a few strokes of color, felt like something selfish, something that could never be afforded when there was rent to pay and bills that piled up faster than they could be counted. Melanie had always known that pursuing art would mean giving up something much more important: stability. And when the time came to choose, stability won. She attended business school, earned a degree in finance, and found herself quickly immersed in the world of numbers and spreadsheets. A well-paying job in business quickly followed. The paychecks were regular. The benefits were great. She had a future in front of her that looked secure, predictable. But Melanie couldn't ignore the void. Even with her successful career at a prestigious firm, Melanie couldn't shake the desire that gnawed at her from the inside. It wasn't that she hated her job, far from it. She was good at it. She thrived in the corporate world, impressing her colleagues and superiors with her sharp mind and meticulous work ethic. But in the stillness of the late hours, when she sat at her desk staring at yet another spreadsheet, she felt something inside her shift, a pull toward something else. Something deeper. Something that had been with her since childhood. She kept a sketchbook hidden in her desk drawer, filled with designs and colorful ideas that had no place in the financial world she lived in. On weekends, she would take long walks through the city, sketching scenes of everyday life: the corner bodega, a family sitting on a park bench, the street musicians playing their melodies. The world around her was rich with color, but when she returned home, she would slide her sketchbook back into its hiding place. It was like a secret. A love she couldn't fully express. The art was always there, waiting, but she pushed it aside. Every time she took a step forward in her corporate career, she was one step further from the dream she had buried when she was young. It was a dream that didn't belong in her world, a dream that wasn't practical, wasn't safe. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, the urge to paint and create was always just beneath the surface, clawing its way into her thoughts. Melanie had always told herself she would get back to it one day, once she had enough saved up, once she made it big. But that day never came. It wasn't just the world that told her to give up her dreams. It was the people around her, the ones who had watched her grow up, the ones who had been there in the tough times, telling her, art won't pay the bills. You need a steady job. You can't just sit around hoping for things to happen. They meant well, of course. Her mom, working double shifts to provide for them both, had always hoped for a better life for Melanie. A life where her daughter didn't have to struggle like she did. Her mom, while loving, had always been practical, urging Melanie to focus on what was realistic. Dreams don't fill an empty fridge, Melanie, she'd say with a soft smile, brushing Melanie's hair back from her face as she worked on the dishes. You need something steady, something that guarantees you a future. And for so many years, Melanie listened. She buried the artist within her. She worked tirelessly, climbing the corporate ladder, proving that she was capable of handling anything the business world threw her way. But the more she succeeded, the emptier she felt inside. The realization hit her hard one evening when she sat at her desk in the sterile, cold office building, surrounded by numbers and corporate jargon. She had just finished another financial report when her eyes wandered over to the small stack of art supplies she kept hidden away in her bottom drawer: brushes, canvas, and a half-finished sketch. It was like a secret she'd been keeping from herself. The sketch was of a woman standing on the corner of a bustling street, surrounded by strangers, yet completely alone. Melanie sat there for a long while, just staring at the canvas, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She thought back to the nights she had spent as a child, drawing in her room, free from the expectations of the world. She remembered the rush of joy she felt when she finished a piece of art, the thrill of seeing her imagination come to life. And then she looked at the blank spreadsheets on her computer screen and felt that spark inside her flicker, just for a second, before it was smothered again by the cold logic of her current life. Over time, the pressure of maintaining her perfect life in the corporate world began to take its toll. Every day, Meline went through the motions, showing up to work, dressing the part, giving the right answers in meetings. She felt like a robot, capable, efficient, but hollow. Her dreams of being an artist, of creating, seemed like distant memories, things that belonged to someone else. She would tell herself that she was fine, that this was what she had to do to survive, to build a future. But when she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. She saw someone who was good at their job, yes, but also someone who had buried their passions and their heart in the name of practicality. And then there was the looming question that gnawed at her every day: what was all of this for? What was the point of it all if she couldn't even find joy in the life she was building? She had money in her savings account, a steady job, and a future that was secure. But she didn't have her art. She didn't have the part of her that made her feel alive. The decision didn't come easily. But after months of feeling increasingly disconnected from the life she had built, Meline realized she couldn't keep going like this. She couldn't keep putting off her dreams for the sake of practicality. She couldn't keep telling herself that one day, when she had enough or when the time was right, she would finally start living the life she had always imagined. It was then, one morning as she walked into the office, that Meline realized something profound: she was done waiting. There was no magic moment, no perfect timing. There was only the choice to live her life as she had always dreamed or continue down a path that made her feel empty. And Meline chose to live. She handed in her resignation letter that day. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let fear hold her back any longer. The corporate world had given her financial stability, but it had also stolen something precious from her: her creativity, her joy, her spark. It was time to take it back. Meline started small. She rented a tiny studio space in a downtown loft and began working on her art again. Every day, she found herself rediscovering the joy of painting, of creating, of expressing herself without fear of judgment. The more she painted, the more alive she felt. And soon, people began to notice. They started buying her work. Her paintings started showing up in local galleries. Slowly, but surely, she was building a life that was hers, one where she was able to live her passion and make a living off it. Meline's alarm blared, as it did every morning at 6:30 a.m., cutting through the silence of the small apartment she had called home for the past 3 years. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle in before she even got out of bed. Her phone buzzed with the usual flood of emails and notifications, a reminder that another day of corporate chaos awaited her. But no matter how much she tried to push it away, a much deeper frustration lingered beneath the surface of her morning routine: the dull, gnawing sense that she was wasting the best part of herself on a job that was slowly eroding her soul. Meline had always been good at pretending. She was good at putting on a smile, showing up at the office, checking things off her to-do list, and pretending to care about the endless meetings and reports that filled her calendar. But none of it mattered. Not when, every evening, she found herself buried in her sketchbook, a faint memory of the artist she had once dreamed of becoming. It wasn't about the work she was doing, it was about what she wasn't doing. For years, Meline had buried her art. The passion she had once poured into her paintings, her sketches, and her designs had been pushed aside to make room for spreadsheets, projections, and budgets. Her dream of being a full-time artist, of living a life where she could create freely, felt like a distant fantasy, something she could never afford. The corporate job that provided stability had slowly become a cage, keeping her locked away from the one thing that made her feel alive. But the cage wasn't just in her mind, it was real, it was tangible, and it came in the form of her boss, Victor Mercer. Victor Mercer, the man who held her dreams hostage. Victor Mercer had been a thorn in Meline's side since day one. He wasn't a bad boss, at least not in the traditional sense. He didn't scream or belittle people publicly. No, his cruelty was much more subtle, wrapped in a veneer of professionalism. He was the type of boss who would nod politely, give you a thin smile, and then slice you to pieces with his backhanded compliments. Every day, Meline would sit in her cramped cubicle, shuffling through financial reports, updating projections, and preparing the documents for the next corporate pitch. Meanwhile, Victor would wander around the office, offering a smile that never reached his eyes, making offhand comments about how artsy Meline's hobbies were. The one time he had glanced at her sketchbook, only to ridicule her for the lack of commercial potential in her work, had been a wake-up call. "Nice sketch, Meline," he'd said that day, flipping through her portfolio. "Too bad this is an office, not an art gallery. You might want to think about your career path again, don't you think?" His words didn't hurt in the way she expected, but they still stung. It wasn't the words themselves, but the implication that her passion for art, the very thing that had made her feel alive as a child, was somehow trivial, laughable, and unworthy of serious pursuit. Victor had made it clear, the corporate world didn't have time for dreams. And that was where Meline found herself. Stuck in a job that, on the surface, was secure. It paid well, offered benefits, and gave her a sense of stability that her childhood had lacked. But the longer she stayed, the more she realized that it wasn't enough. The security she'd fought for was starting to feel like a prison. The weight of unfulfilled dreams. Each morning, Meline woke up and faced the cold, hard truth: she was an artist trapped in a world of numbers. The job was safe, sure, but her heart wasn't in it. Her heart hadn't been in it for years. The financial reports, the quarterly forecasts, the endless email chains, none of it mattered. It was all a means to an end, an endless cycle of tasks that kept her distracted from what she truly wanted. Meline sat at her desk, pushing the numbers around, trying to make sense of it all. She glanced at the clock on her computer screen. It was almost time for the next meeting, and the pressure of the day's workload was already mounting. Victor would come in, as he always did, with his air of superiority, offering unsolicited advice, scrutinizing the team's progress, and making comments about how things could always be better. Meline had learned to nod and smile, to agree with whatever he said, even when it felt like her dreams were being suffocated. She had spent so many years in the office, burying her dreams in the back of her mind, telling herself that one day, once she'd made it, she would pick up her brushes again. But one day never came. The dreams never materialized because there was always a deadline, always another project, always someone else telling her what she should be doing. It was the crushing realization that art, for her, had become nothing more than a distant fantasy. Her passion was like an ember in the back of her mind, always glowing but never allowed to ignite. But the ember was still there. Every night, when she came home and opened the drawer where she kept her sketchbook, she could still feel it. It was a spark that she couldn't ignore. Her art was her true calling, and no matter how hard she tried to push it down, it always resurfaced. She had been trying to ignore it for too long, but deep down, Meline knew it was always going to be there, waiting for her to make a decision. Would she continue to suppress her passion, or would she take the leap and go after her dreams? Could she live with herself knowing that she had chosen security over what she truly loved? The final straw came one late afternoon, when Meline found herself huddled in the conference room, going through yet another financial pitch. Victor stood at the front, droning on about market analysis, and all Meline could think about was the painting she had left unfinished at home. She had spent the last few weeks sketching it during lunch breaks, finding small moments of solace in the strokes of her paintbrush, but now it seemed like that part of her was becoming a distant memory. Victor's voice broke through her thoughts. "Meline, are you with us?" She blinked, looking up at her boss, who was staring at her with a smirk. "Sorry, yes," she said, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. She quickly flipped through the pages of her report. Victor's grin widened. "I just wanted to make sure you were paying attention. Maybe you're distracted because of all those artistic hobbies of yours. Maybe you should focus a little more on the numbers, Meline. We don't need more dreamers around here." The words stung, though they were nothing new. But this time, something inside Meline snapped. She could feel the lump in her throat, the sense of suffocation that had been building for months, maybe even years. For the first time, she felt like she couldn't breathe. And it wasn't just because of Victor's words. It was because she knew that no matter how much she tried to push her passion aside, no matter how much she tried to bury it, it would always be there, waiting for her to make a choice. That night, after the office emptied and the world outside was dark and cold, Meline sat at her desk, staring at the blank page before her. She had taken the first steps toward this moment years ago. She had traded her art for security, thinking that if she just worked hard enough, she would find peace. But now, with the pressure of corporate life closing in around her, she realized she had been lying to herself all along. The truth was simple: she couldn't live this way anymore. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she had been avoiding for months, her childhood friend, Sarah. The line clicked open. "Hey, Meline. What's up?" Sarah's voice was always warm, and Meline felt a wave of relief wash over her. "I need to talk," Meline said, her voice shaking. "I'm stuck, Sarah. I feel like I'm dying inside, and I don't know what to do." There was a long pause on the other end. Sarah was quiet, but Meline could hear the understanding in her silence. "Meline, you've always known what you wanted. You're just afraid to take the leap. But you have to. If you don't, you'll always be stuck." Meline's heart was still racing as she sat in the sterile conference room, her palms sweaty on the table in front of her. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a harsh glow over her, making her feel more isolated than ever. She tried to focus on what Victor, her boss, was saying, but the words felt like they were coming from a distance, a dull noise that couldn't reach her. She had been in the corporate world for years now. She had built her career from the ground up, balancing spreadsheets, filing reports, and contributing to endless meetings with nothing but sheer grit. And, despite how much she had buried her creative soul in the process, she had told herself she was doing the right thing. This was the responsible path. The safe path. She had sacrificed her art, convinced herself that this was the best way to secure her future. But now, as Victor paced in front of her with his usual arrogant stride, a sickening realization was setting in. The glass walls of the meeting room, so sleek and modern, felt like they were closing in on her. The air was suffocating, and for the first time in a long time, Meline felt like she couldn't breathe. "Look, Meline," Victor's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "I've been patient. But let's be honest, this isn't working. Your performance has been underwhelming. And I think you know where this is heading." Her stomach twisted as he spoke, the words hitting her like a wave. Underwhelming. Not enough. She had heard the whispers around the office, the murmurs of discontent. She had seen the way people looked at her when she didn't meet their expectations, the subtle way they judged her. And now, it was coming to a head. Meline had always been one of the most reliable employees. She had delivered results, even when her heart wasn't in it. She had been the one to handle the difficult projects, to stay late when others left early, to carry the weight of the team's success on her shoulders. But somewhere along the way, she had lost herself. She had poured all her energy into this job, convinced that this was the life she was meant to lead. And now, here she was, being told that it wasn't enough. She had spent years building this career, sacrificing her true passion. She had silenced the artist inside her, telling herself that one day she would get to it, one day she would return to her paintings. But one day never came. Instead, she had become a cog in the machine, an anonymous face in the corporate grind. And now, it felt like all that hard work had amounted to nothing. Her hands trembled as she picked up the documents on the table, her eyes blurred with the weight of it all. The finality of Victor's words echoed in her mind. "Your contract is terminated," he said, his voice cool and detached. "HR will give you the details." The room seemed to spin. Meline felt the ground beneath her give way as she stood up shakily, her legs unsteady as she walked out of the room. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The job she had sacrificed so much for, the job that had given her financial security, had just slipped through her fingers. She reached her desk in a daze, the weight of the reality setting in with each step. Her colleagues avoided her gaze, no one offering any words of comfort. She sat down in her cubicle, staring at the empty screen of her computer. The space around her felt so hollow. She couldn't stop the overwhelming feeling of failure that pressed against her chest. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her mom. "Are you coming home soon? Let me know if you need anything." Meline's throat tightened. She could already hear her mom's disapproving voice in her head, the way she had always told Meline that she needed to find a real job, that art wasn't something that paid the bills. Art was just a hobby, a dream, something that didn't matter in the real world. Meline wiped her eyes, trying to hold herself together. She didn't have time for this. She had bills to pay, a future to figure out. She couldn't afford to get emotional. But as she sat there in the empty cubicle, the weight of it all finally hit her. The job she had worked so hard for, the life she had built, it had all come crashing down. Her hands were shaking as she gathered her things, shoving her pens, her coffee mug, and her notebook into a box. She could feel the eyes of her coworkers on her, some of them offering polite nods, others avoiding her gaze. She had spent years trying to impress these people, trying to make herself fit into a mold that wasn't her own. And now, in a single moment, it was over. As she walked toward the elevator, box in hand, Meline felt her shoulders slump. She had given everything to this job, but it hadn't been enough. She had given up her dreams, her creativity, all for the sake of security. And now, she had nothing to show for it. But just as she reached the elevator doors, a familiar voice called out her name. "Meline?" She turned to see Harold, the janitor, standing there with his cart. His tired eyes were soft, but there was something in his gaze that made her pause. "Harold?" Meline said, surprised. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were still here." He nodded, his movements slow as he adjusted the cart. "I saw you walking out of Victor's office. You look like you could use a break." Meline forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I guess you could say that." Harold didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at her for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key, handing it to her. "What's this?" Meline asked, her eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "It's a key," Harold said simply, his voice soft but firm. "It's for a studio space. My late wife, Eleanor, was an artist, and she kept this place for years. It's tucked away, but it's hers. Now, it's yours. If you want it." Meline stared at the key in his hand, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't understand. Why are you giving this to me?" Harold smiled gently. "Because Eleanor always said that if you're going to follow your passion, you can't wait for someone else to give you permission. She said, a key is just a key, but the door it opens leads to the future you deserve." Meline's heart hammered in her chest. She had spent so long trying to chase stability, trying to convince herself that she didn't need to follow her art. She had buried that dream deep inside, kept it hidden in a drawer, away from the harsh realities of her world. But this was different. Harold's words hung in the air like a lifeline, and the key in her hand felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just a key, it was an invitation. An invitation to reclaim her life, to rediscover the passion that had always burned inside her. The key didn't just open a door to a studio, it opened a door to the future she had always dreamed of but had never dared to step through. "Why me?" Meline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why give me this?" Harold shrugged, the lines on his face deepening as he spoke. "You've got something in you, Meline. Eleanor saw it in you the first time she met you. She knew you were meant for something more than this. It's time to start believing that, too." Meline's fingers curled around the key, her breath coming in short, shaky bursts. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't in years: hope. Hope that she could still follow her dreams. Hope that it wasn't too late. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this key would open the door to everything she had been afraid to pursue. "Thank you, Harold," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Harold said with a wink. "Just go. Do what you were meant to do." As she walked away from the building, Meline held the key tightly in her hand. The weight of it wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. It represented the beginning of something new, a chance to reclaim the dream she had left behind. For the first time in years, Meline felt a spark of excitement ignite in her chest. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be struggles. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. Ready to open the door to the future she had always dreamed of. And as she stepped out into the world, her heart filled with the knowledge that this time, she wasn't waiting for permission. She was taking the leap. Meline's hands trembled slightly as she turned the key in the lock. The small studio, tucked away in the heart of the city, had been abandoned for years. She could feel the dust under her fingertips as she pushed open the door, her heart racing in anticipation. This was the moment. The key Harold had given her, once just a symbol of possibility, had now become a tangible promise, a promise of a new life. The studio was a far cry from the pristine office spaces she had spent so many years in. The walls were bare, the floors covered with a thin layer of dust, and the sunlight poured through the large, dirty windows. It smelled faintly of old paint and wood. It was the kind of place that could either inspire a person to create or crush them under its weight. Meline took a deep breath, inhaling the dusty air as she stepped inside. The studio was a mess, but it was her mess now. It was hers to shape, to breathe life into. The space was small but full of potential. The rough edges, the unfinished corners, they all felt like opportunities waiting to be seized. This place, where art once flourished in Eleanor's time, would become her sanctuary, her place of expression, her refuge from the world she had spent so many years trying to escape. Meline felt a surge of excitement as she looked around. The space was far from perfect, but it didn't need to be. All it needed was her, the artist who had been stifled for too long. For days, Meline worked tirelessly to transform the space. She painted the walls, cleaned out the old canvases, and brought in new supplies. She spent hours sketching, painting, and pushing her creative limits. The act of creating felt different now. It felt real. It felt like she was breathing life back into something that had been dormant for far too long. Her paintings began to take shape, each one more vivid, more alive than the last. The brushstrokes were bold, full of passion, of raw emotion. For the first time in years, Meline felt like herself. The work flowed from her hands effortlessly. She had forgotten what it felt like to create without fear, to paint without worrying about whether it would be good enough, whether it would be accepted. She was free. She was finally doing what she loved. The first few weeks in the studio were a blur. Meline painted constantly, filling the space with her artwork. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty. There were moments of doubt, times when she questioned whether she was doing the right thing. The comfort of a steady paycheck, the security of her former job, still lingered in her mind. But every time she picked up the paintbrush, she knew she had made the right decision. Each piece she created felt like a piece of herself coming back to life. It wasn't long before Meline realized she needed to take the next step, she needed to put her work out into the world. She started small, posting photos of her paintings on social media, hoping to reach someone, anyone who might see her work for what it was, raw, unrefined, but full of heart. To her surprise, the response was positive. People started commenting, liking, and sharing. A few local galleries even reached out to ask if she would consider showcasing her pieces. The recognition didn't come overnight, but it came. Slowly, Meline began to feel the weight of her fear lifting. Her art was speaking for itself. The doubts, the worries, the years of self-doubt she had carried with her for so long, those were starting to fade. One night, she received an email from a small art gallery downtown. They wanted to feature her work in their upcoming exhibit. It was a dream come true. The gallery wasn't huge, but it was a start, a very real, tangible start. Meline's heart raced as she read the email. She couldn't believe it. This is it, she thought. This is the moment I've been waiting for. The exhibit was a huge success. People admired her work, and a few pieces sold that night. Meline felt like she was floating. It wasn't just the money, it was the validation. It was the feeling that she had finally found her place in the world, that she was finally doing what she was meant to do. It was the first step toward the life she had always dreamed of, the life she had pushed aside for so long. As the months went by, Meline's success continued to grow. She began to sell her paintings regularly, and her reputation as an up-and-coming artist began to spread. She didn't have the luxury of taking breaks. Every day was filled with painting, social media posts, emails, and gallery openings. But it was work she loved. Work that made her feel alive. Meline's confidence grew with every new piece she created, with every new connection she made in the art world. But it wasn't just the success that fueled her, it was the process of creating. The thrill of picking up a brush, the joy of bringing a vision to life, the catharsis of pouring her heart onto the canvas, it all came together to remind her of something she had forgotten for so long: art was her calling. Her work began to evolve. She started experimenting with new styles, new techniques. She moved beyond the landscape she had always painted and began exploring abstract art, portraits, and mixed media. She didn't hold herself back anymore. There were no more limitations. There was no fear of rejection. The more she painted, the more she discovered about herself, about the things she had been afraid to confront, about the emotions she had buried deep inside her. Meline's paintings became more than just beautiful pieces of art, they became windows into her soul. They were raw, vulnerable, and full of emotion. And people saw that. They connected with it. They saw the real Meline in every brushstroke, in every color, in every line. Months passed, and Meline's life continued to transform. She was no longer just an artist in a small studio. She was a professional, someone who had created her own path, who had built a life she was proud of. Her success wasn't just measured by the money she made, though that was important. It wasn't just about the recognition she had received from galleries or art buyers. It was about the fulfillment, the sense of purpose, the joy she found in every piece she painted. It was about waking up every day and knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Meline had come a long way from the corporate world. She had traded the cold, lifeless spreadsheets for the vibrant, living canvas of her imagination. And though the journey hadn't been easy, though there had been times when she doubted herself, she had made it. She had found her place in the world. But most importantly, Meline had rediscovered her passion. She had rediscovered herself. Her studio became her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe and create without fear. She painted with abandon now, free from the shackles of expectation and self-doubt. She wasn't just painting for the world. She was painting for herself. And that was enough. Her work began to gain attention. She was invited to showcase her art at more galleries, to collaborate with other artists, and to participate in international exhibitions. Her art was no longer just a hobby or a fleeting dream. It was her life. And it was a life that she had built with her own hands, one brushstroke at a time. Meline sat in her studio late one evening, the soft hum of the city outside her window the only sound. She looked at the painting she had just finished, a bold, abstract piece that had come from deep within her heart. It was different from anything she had done before, but it felt like the truest representation of herself. She smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. This was it. She had finally found her place. And it wasn't just in the art world. It was in herself. Meline had embraced the opportunity to live her dream, to transform the studio into a thriving space for her art. She had stepped away from the fears that had once held her back and replaced them with the courage to chase what she truly wanted. And in doing so, she had not only found success but also rediscovered her soul. As she packed up for the night, Meline knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. The dream she had once put on hold was now her reality. She had made it. And she was just getting started. It's funny how time can shift everything, how one moment can change the course of your life in ways you never expected. 2 years had passed since Meline first stepped into that tiny studio, feeling the weight of doubt and fear heavy on her shoulders. Back then, it was just a dream, an idea, a distant thought of something that could never come to fruition. She'd been fired from her corporate job, handed a key by Harold, and told to follow her heart. It felt like a gamble, a risk that could either make or break her. But in the end, it wasn't about the gamble at all. It was about trusting herself. As Meline stood in the doorway of her studio now, 2 years later, she couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. The small, dusty room she had once walked into with hesitation and uncertainty had blossomed into a thriving, bustling space that echoed with the sound of creativity. Canvases lined the walls, some finished, some in progress, and the faint smell of oil paint filled the air, mixing with the scent of coffee from the corner cafe. The room was hers, no longer a space of fear and doubt, but one of freedom and fulfillment. The transformation was beyond anything Meline could have ever imagined. The work had come in waves, unpredictable and often overwhelming. But with every piece she completed, with every stroke of her paintbrush, she felt herself growing, not just as an artist, but as a person. The woman who had once sat in a corporate office, drowning in spreadsheets and projections, was now living a life she had designed for herself. She had traded the security of the business world for the unpredictability of the art world, and every moment had been worth it. Her studio was no longer just a sanctuary. It had become a destination. Word of her work had spread, slowly at first, then faster as her name began to gain recognition. Exhibits, gallery shows, and commissions had started to flow in, and with each new opportunity, Meline felt the weight of her former self, her doubts, her fears, fade away. She was a professional artist now. The artist she had always dreamed of being. But success hadn't come easy. There had been days when she questioned herself, when the bills piled up and the stress of making a living off her passion seemed overwhelming. She had stared at her paintings, wondering if they were enough. Wondering if she was enough. But those doubts didn't last long. Not with the foundation she had built. Not with the lessons she had learned. And certainly not with the support of the people who mattered most. Harold had been her anchor throughout the entire journey. When Meline had walked into that studio, unsure of her next step, Harold had seen something in her that no one else had: the quiet fire, the spark that had been buried under years of corporate restraint. He didn't just hand her a key, he gave her permission to believe in herself. For 2 years, Harold had been a steady presence in Meline's life. He was more than just the janitor who had opened the door to the studio, he was the mentor she hadn't known she needed. With his kind, weathered eyes, he taught her to trust in the process. He reminded her that art wasn't about being perfect, it was about being honest, being real. The brush doesn't lie, he'd often say, looking at her work with the same quiet approval he'd given her on that first day. You just have to listen to it. Harold didn't want recognition. He didn't need accolades. He just wanted to see Meline succeed because he believed in her. He knew the power of art, the way it could heal, the way it could set a person free. And in his quiet way, he had pushed her to take risks, to break through the boundaries she had built around herself. Whenever Meline doubted her worth, whenever she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, it was Harold who was there. He would always say the same thing: "You've got the gift, Meline. But it's not enough just to have the gift. You've got to be brave enough to share it with the world." And she did. As Meline's career continued to flourish, she learned that being an artist was not just about creating beautiful things, it was about living authentically. For years, she had buried her creativity in favor of financial security, thinking that stability was the key to happiness. But now, she understood that the true key to happiness was living a life that felt true to herself. Her art was no longer just a way to pass the time or a hobby she kept hidden away. It was her livelihood. It was the thing that made her feel alive. And as she looked at the pieces hanging in her studio, the ones that had once been just ideas in her mind, she realized something profound. Art wasn't just about the final product, it was about the journey. The struggle. The growth. Each brushstroke was a step closer to the woman she was becoming. And with every piece she completed, she felt more confident in her identity as an artist, as a person, and as someone who had finally stepped into her power. One of the biggest challenges Meline had faced over the past 2 years was the fear of failure. She had grown up thinking that success came with a clear, defined path, one that was safe, predictable, and free of risk. But her time in the studio had taught her that success was messy. It was about stepping into the unknown, taking risks, and being okay with uncertainty. At first, Meline had hesitated. She had been terrified that people would reject her work. She worried that she wouldn't be good enough. The fear of being judged, of failing publicly, had almost stopped her before she could even begin. But with each small victory, each sale, each show, each positive review, Meline began to replace that fear with confidence. She didn't have to wait for anyone's approval. She was creating her own path, one filled with both risks and rewards. There were times when she stumbled. There were nights when the doubts crept in again, when she wondered if she was just a small fish in a big pond, or whether her art was even good enough. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. As her reputation grew, she began to trust in her abilities, to believe that she deserved this success. She wasn't just a businesswoman or a painter. She was both, and that was something no one could take from her. The first time Meline saw her artwork in a major gallery exhibition, she had to pinch herself. She had been invited to showcase a series of portraits she had created, and as she walked through the gallery, seeing her pieces displayed on the walls, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride. People were stopping to admire her work. They were pointing, talking about it, reacting to it. Meline didn't need to hear the words. The looks on their faces, the way they lingered in front of her pieces, told her everything. She had made it. She had created something that resonated with people. Her work wasn't just about personal expression, it was about connection. She was able to convey emotions, stories, and truths through paint, and in doing so, she was connecting with the world. It wasn't just about what she was painting, it was about what the paintings made people feel. It wasn't long before collectors started approaching her, buying pieces, commissioning work. The recognition was slow at first, but it was steady. Every gallery show, every positive review, every sale was a step closer to the future she had always wanted. And in the quiet moments, when Meline sat alone in her studio, surrounded by her work, she realized something important: the journey wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about finding the courage to be herself, to pursue her passion, and to live her truth, no matter how hard it had been to get here. 2 years later, Meline stood in front of her studio, looking out at the city that had always felt so distant to her. The skyline, once intimidating and foreign, now felt like a part of her story. She had come so far, farther than she could have ever imagined when she first picked up the key Harold had handed her, so long ago. She had built this life from nothing. She had transformed the small, dusty studio into a thriving business. She had turned her passion for painting into a career. The transition hadn't been easy, and the road had been full of bumps along the way, but every setback had only made her stronger. Meline was no longer afraid of failure. She was no longer worried about the judgments of others. She had embraced the uncertainty of her journey and realized that it was the uncertainty that made it beautiful. Each day was a new opportunity to create, to grow, and to become the woman she was always meant to be. And as she stood there, looking at the city she now called home, she knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning.
That's it for today's story on Life Reflections. I'd love to hear your take. Drop a comment below with your thoughts or a story of your own. If you enjoyed this, give a like and subscribe to keep the reflections coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.